123. Natural Law and Canon Law. Chalcedon Position Paper, number 55, October 1984. Words change their meanings with time, and it is a mistake to assume that an older or original meaning still governs the word. Thus, the word silly once meant good or blessed. Farm meant a tax, and farmer was a tax collector. Vote could mean either a plea or prayer, or a determination, or an expression of will, which is closer to its present meaning. These and other words have changed in meaning, and it is important in using writings of the past to understand each change of meaning in the term. One such very changed term is natural law. It comes from the ancient Greeks, who meant something very different by it than many recognize. First of all, for the Greek thinkers, nature was not fallen. Second, the material world was divided into two substances, matter and ideas. The ideas or patterns were universals which good reasoning could discover, so that the philosophers, in their reasoning, assumed that their rational conclusions were correct, represented natural law. Aristotle and Plato thus assumed that their political reasoning grasped the universals of life, and thus represented true order and natural law. The distinction was between man-made law, what unreasoning men legislated, and natural law, what the philosophers saw as the logos, or reason of being. Natural law thus claimed to set forth the true order in nature. We can say that Marx, in describing the inevitable historical process and its conclusion, echoed natural law in this sense. The medieval era had a different concept at first, although never entirely free from the Greek inheritance. Gratian, circa 1148, wrote, "Mankind is ruled in two ways, namely, by natural law and by customs. The law of nature is that contained in the law and the Gospels. Decretum, Part 1, Distinction 1. In subsequent passages, the Greek influence is apparent, but for most men of his day, biblical law was seen as natural law, the law of the Creator by which all things were governed. In Aquinas, the Greek revival was strong. Natural law was seen as something pertaining to right reason. God and man share a common being, and all beings other than God are not their own being, but are beings by participation. Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 44, Answer 1. This represented a shift from creation to participation, a Greek concept. It meant that the intellectual principle which we call the human soul is incorruptible. Question 75, Answer 6. The rational creature, therefore, shares in the eternal reason, and such participation of the rational creature in the eternal law is called natural law. Question 91, Answer 2. Nicholas of Cusa, circa 1400 to 1464, also held to this. Since natural law is naturally in the reason, every law is known to man in its root. Such thinking bypassed the doctrine of creation, and it made void the doctrine of the fall. Evil became metaphysical instead of moral, and was equated with non-being. All being was good because all being by participation was continuous with God's being. The revival of Aristotle made the Enlightenment inevitable, because the Enlightenment simply took over these concepts of right reason and natural law and carried them to their logical conclusion. Christianity and the Church were very quickly seen to be excess baggage. If right reason is expressive of natural law, then the rational state, that is, that order established by philosopher kings, is the true state and expression of natural law. If right reason is expressive of natural law, then the rational state, that is, that order established by philosopher kings, is the true state and expressive of natural law. The theory of the divine right of kings held to the royal manifestation of natural power and law. The two great enemies of the divine right of kings were the Jesuits and the Calvinists. The Jesuits upheld the power of the papacy to govern all things spiritual and to declare God's will for rulers. The Calvinists insisted on the sovereignty of God over church and state. The divine right of kings was a curious doctrine. It held to the claim that the king's power came directly from God to the king. Some exponents of this theory attached the divine right to the office rather than the person, but this limitation was rejected by men like James I of England. The right was natural and hereditary, as well as divine. Like the private succession of land under feudal law, divine right was a natural hereditary possession belonging to a royal line and its rightful heirs. Hence, care was given to establish the legitimate order of succession. The power of divine right included nothing less than the complete disposal of his subjects' persons and property. Charles Howard McIlwain, editor, The Political Works of James I, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1918, pages 33 to 34. Kings were thus little gods, according to James I. No supernatural law could take priority over or be cited against this natural succession. As a result, there was an increasing de-emphasis of biblical law and supernaturalism in favor of natural law and right reason. One consequence very early was deism. Another, later on, was Romanticism. Nature became the new source of law, learning, and revelation. William Wordsworth in The Tables Turned said, "One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can." Plato and Aristotle held that persons or things were only rightly employed when used according to their nature. The Stoic morality summed up the matter in the precept, "Follow nature." Jeremy Bentham, in An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789, saw all standards of right and wrong determined by pleasure and pain. Darwin added to this triumph of natural law the thesis of a struggle for survival, and Herbert Spencer identified the right with what is conducive to survival. The moral content, a biblical content of natural law and creation, had been reduced to zero. If it feels good, do it. By making nature normative, natural law advocates had made sin normative, and the pro-abortion, homosexual, quote, rights, end quote, movements and like causes are the logical outcomes of this fact. At a recent meeting of Christian leaders, a natural law advocate was challenged to define or name an agreed-upon content of natural law. The theologian making the challenge called attention to the fact that the concept is contentless unless borrowings are made from Scripture. Two political leaders asked, "What does natural law have to say about adultery and fornication?" The answer? That question is irrelevant. Natural law thinking, when pursued consistently, ends up in antinomianism and Arminianism. Creation's meaning, which he did not consistently maintain, is best maintained by seeing God's law as over nature, not inherent in it. When Paul speaks of the inescapable knowledge of God in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, he does not say that this knowledge is seen in creation, but from the creation of the world. This is a clearly different meaning. The fact that many natural law advocates, Catholic and Protestant, have been fine men does not alter the fact that the concept has been a confused one. It has readily lent itself to misuse because it begins with a false premise. The venerable antiquity of a concept does not give it truth. After all, the premise of sin, Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, every man as his own God and lawmaker, goes back to the Garden of Eden. Whatever usefulness the doctrine may have had has long since been lost. Even more, why cling to so nebulous a concept of natural law when we have the clear and written law of God, the Bible? It seems that the abiding value of natural law is to give men a chance to puff themselves up as the discoverers of law. At this point, it is necessary to contrast natural law and canon law. Ask almost anyone what canon law is, and most will tell you it is ecclesiastical or church law, a mistake made even by the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1910, because they define it, not historically, but in terms of today. The word canon means a rule, a straight line or measure. Paul uses the word in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, kanonos, and verse 16, kanonai, as well as Galatians chapter 6, verse 16, kanonai. The early church used the term extensively. Irenaeus called the baptismal creed the canon of truth. Others spoke of the canon of faith. As the early councils faced problems, they set forth canons or truths and laws in terms of Scripture. True canon law is biblical law. Canon law most certainly applied and applies to the Church, but we miss a critical fact of history if we fail to see that Christians have always held that canon law applies also to nations. Two current examples of this application to nations are God's laws, or the rule or canons concerning abortion and homosexuality. During most of the Church's history, the Church has seen God's rule or canon as applicable to all men, institutions, and states. In fact, the justice pagans recognized in old Rome in the canon law led them to go to church courts with their cases. So much of the litigation by AD 300 was in the hands of the church courts that Constantine, on gaining power, gave all bishops the status of Roman magistrates in order to give official status to the governing courts. To this day, bishops wear the garb and carry the insignia of Roman magistrates. For some centuries after the fall of Rome, canon or biblical law was the only law of Europe. Biblical law was the essential law of American colonies and the early republic. Recently, several nominal Catholics deny the relevance of God's law to the state, insisting on consensus and private choice. These persons, Governor Mario Cuomo, Senator Edward Kennedy, and Representative Geraldine Ferraro, all bucking for the status of heretic first class, were reminded by the columnist John Lofton, Calvinist first class. Canon 21 of the Council of Trent's 6th Session decree says this: "If anyone says that Jesus Christ was given by God to men as a Redeemer in whom to trust, and not also as a legislator whom to obey, let him be anathema." The Washington Times, September the 21st, 1984, page 3A. Canon or biblical law was restricted to the Church by the rise of natural law. The natural law advocates, in turning to the Greco-Roman concept, did not realize what they were doing. Ostensibly, they found classical support for biblical faith. In reality, they undermined it. The natural sphere could now claim to be a source of law. The Church was seen as the voice of the supernatural kingdom and realm, and the state as the voice and head of the natural sphere and realm. This freed the monarchs from the constraints of canon law. Each could now claim to be his own law sphere. The Church was to limit itself to the, quote, spiritual, end quote, sphere, and the state was to rule the natural sphere. This meant that the Church was to keep out of that law sphere which belonged to the state, and its canons might be valid for the believer's private life, but not in civil life. Of late, Governor Cuomo of New York and vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro have echoed this argument. The results have been deadly. The state, with its independent law sphere, now recognises no canon or rule other than its will. Both in Protestant and Catholic countries, there is a wide gap between the canon professed within the Church and the canon professed by the same persons within the state. Where there is no universal canon, there is hypocrisy and social decay. A significant legal term is the rule of law, that is, the canon of law. The primary meaning of the rule of law is its supremacy over all things, its application to all classes and groups, and the exclusion of all exemptions from its province. In other words, the rule of law means the Catholicity or universality of law. The significant part of the rule of law concept is that it is reference to the state's law, not God's. The law of the state has become the new canon law because the state claims sovereignty or lordship. It is the natural order in its full power, and it recognizes no other canon or rule, least of all now from God and by God. A good many years ago, when I was somewhat younger, I listened in silence to an informal discussion on natural law by Christian and non-Christian advocates of it. They had dismissed their differences in response to a woman's statement that natural law did not seem to affirm any clear-cut content, by saying that this was true of the Bible too, because interpretations differed. Where, asked the woman, are your 10 Commandments? We may differ in their numbering, but the words are the same for all Christians. They had no real answer. Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. At that, he got more than those who abandoned God's canon for that of fallen nature